At New York's most expensive and famous restaurant, Kingsley, a sudden hush fell over the room, as if time itself had paused. Conversations stopped, forks and knives froze mid-air, and every gaze focused on one spot, a small open space between two tables. 10-year-old Lucas Montgomery, his legs braced in metal supports, was trembling. His eyes were downcast, but his hand was extended in a simple gesture of invitation. He had turned toward the restaurant's only black waitress, Diana Johnson. The soft melody of a piano echoed through the air, and Lucas had been struck by a sudden thought. He wanted to invite someone to dance. "Sir, control your son." Manager Thornton's sharp voice shattered the magic of the moment. "This is not a dance hall, and our staff is not here to entertain children." Richard Montgomery, one of the wealthiest men in the country and the owner of Montgomery Investments, swallowed hard. It was the first time he had taken his son out in public since the accident 2 years ago, which had left Lucas partially paralyzed. "Lucas, sit down." The command was soft but firm. Diana stood still, a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. In the 5 years she'd worked there, she had learned to make herself invisible, especially around clients like Richard Montgomery. "Mr. Thornton, I'm leaving. My shift is over." Her voice was calm. She removed her apron, placed it on the tray, and looked gently at Lucas. "I can't dance with an apron on." All eyes were now locked on Diana. "What are you doing?" Richard asked, clearly surprised. "Accepting an invitation, sir," she replied, meeting his gaze. Lucas hesitated before stepping forward. The metal braces on his legs scraped softly against the floor. Diana didn't stop him. She didn't assist him either. She simply moved in rhythm with his pace. "She'll be fired by tomorrow," a woman whispered from another table. Richard stood frozen. A faded memory gripped him, his late wife Elizabeth dancing with Lucas in their living room. "Connection matters more than perfection," she used to say. Diana's gentleness and the transformation on Lucas's face, where fear gave way to focus and shame to pride, touched Richard deeply. For the first time since the accident, Lucas wasn't just walking, he was leading. "Mr. Montgomery, I assure you this won't happen again," the manager interjected. "She'll be strictly reprimanded." Richard said nothing. Everyone waited for his verdict, knowing that a single word from him could cost the woman her job. But something had changed in his eyes. Diana gently walked Lucas back to his table. "Thank you for the invitation," she said sincerely, speaking to him like an equal. "It was an honor." As she turned to leave, Richard spoke. "Wait." His voice was unfamiliar, softer, almost human. "Your full name?" "Diana Johnson, sir." Richard nodded slowly, as if trying to commit the name to memory. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a card, and handed it to her. "Come to my office at 10 a.m. tomorrow." The restaurant fell silent again. Breaths were held. Diana accepted the card, her hands trembling slightly. "Dad, why did you do that?" Lucas's question hung in the air like the soft final note of the piano melody. Richard looked at his son, and then back at Diana, now walking away with grace and quiet dignity. "Because she reminded me," he whispered, "what real courage looks like." "Mr. Montgomery," Diana approached, wearing simple clothes with the program's logo stitched over her heart. Her tone was polite but firm, the kind reserved for people who needed to be reminded that respect was mutual. "Welcome to Freedom Steps." Richard nodded stiffly, his eyes scanning the modest room. It was a far cry from the sterile, white clinics he was used to. Here, the air was filled with motion, energy, laughter, even struggle. But it was alive. It was real. Children of different backgrounds moved with a freedom that made no sense to logic, but resonated with something deeper. Lucas looked around with wide eyes. He seemed hesitant but intrigued. One boy in a wheelchair spun in a slow, awkward circle. while another girl with crutches tapped her foot to the rhythm echoing from an old speaker. There was no judgment, only presence. Diana crouched down to Lucas's level. "Would you like to try? No rules. Just feel the music." Lucas looked at his father. Richard didn't speak. Instead, he gave a small nod, an unspoken permission, heavy with uncertainty. Lucas hesitated for only a moment longer before wheeling himself toward the other children. Diana smiled and stood up. "You'll need to sign in," she told Richard, gesturing toward the clipboard at the reception table. "I didn't bring him here for this," Richard said quietly, almost defensively. Diana didn't flinch. "Then why did you bring him?" Richard looked over at Lucas again, now slowly bobbing his shoulders to the beat as another child encouraged him. "Because I saw something in his eyes, something I haven't seen in a long time. That wasn't me," Diana said softly. "That was him. I just gave him permission to lead." Richard didn't respond. Instead, he sat on one of the folding chairs along the wall and watched. Later, while the class continued, Zoe approached Diana with a concerned look. "We're still short for rent next month," she whispered. "I know," Diana replied, "but if Lucas keeps coming back, maybe others will too. Maybe even sponsors." Zoe raised an eyebrow. "You're pinning hope on a billionaire's heart." "No," Diana replied, eyes on Richard. "I'm betting on a father's regret." When the class ended, Lucas was flushed with energy. He hadn't moved like that in months, not since before the accident. As Diana helped him settle down, he looked up at her. "Will you teach me that spin move?" Diana smiled. "Only if you promise to teach me something in return." Lucas grinned. "Deal." Richard stood up, clearly surprised by his son's lightness. "Same time next week?" Diana asked. Richard hesitated, then nodding, said, "Yes." The next few weeks passed in unexpected rhythm. Richard brought Lucas every Tuesday and Thursday without fail. He never stayed for long, just enough to observe from a distance. Lucas, however, blossomed. He laughed more, engaged more. He even made friends. One day, Richard arrived early. Diana was teaching the kids breathing exercises before dance. "Why breathing?" he asked, breaking the routine silence. "Because breath is rhythm," she answered, "and rhythm is control. Kids like Lucas often feel like their bodies have betrayed them. But breath? That's something they can own." He watched her for a moment, then said, "You're different from what I expected." Diana turned to him, smiling faintly. That's what happens when expectations are shaped by assumptions. One evening, Richard lingered after class. The other parents had gone, and Lucas was helping fold chairs. Diana wiped down mats as he approached. "I want to fund your program," he said abruptly. Diana paused. "Why?" "Because it works, and because I've been blind. I see that now." "Not enough," she replied. He blinked. "What?" "You can't just write a check and walk away. These kids don't need another absent benefactor. They need voices, time, visibility, commitment." Richard was silent. Then slowly he said, "Then teach me." Diana studied him. The walls around him weren't made of money or pride anymore, just fear, and maybe a little hope. "Okay," she said. "But the first lesson is simple. Don't come here as Richard Montgomery, CEO. Come as Lucas's father." Over time, things began to change. Richard volunteered to repaint the community center walls. Not alone, of course. He brought staff from his companies, those willing to help. Freedom Steps got new mats, fresh speakers, even uniforms. But more importantly, it got attention. Media started to notice. Donations trickled in. And most shockingly, of all, other parents like Richard started showing up. Parents who were once too proud to admit they didn't have all the answers. One day, Lucas asked Diana a question she didn't expect. "Why don't you work at a fancy clinic?" She knelt beside him. "Because I believe healing doesn't only happen on examination tables. It happens in places where people are seen, not just treated. Lucas thought about that, then nodded. I think you're right. One afternoon, a familiar figure appeared at the door. Winters, Richard's no-nonsense executive assistant. I thought you said you didn't work for men like him, she said, smirking. I don't, Diana replied. He works with us now. Winters chuckled. The board thinks he's having a midlife crisis. Investing in dance programs? They don't get it. They will, Diana said, eventually. As the sun set that evening, the children formed a circle, each one expressing their joy through movement, some with arms, some with wheels, some only with smiles. Lucas spun his chair with confidence. Diana watched him, her eyes welling slightly. Richard stood beside her. I never told you what happened to him. You didn't need to, she replied. He's telling his own story now. Richard nodded slowly. Thank you. Diana looked at him. Don't thank me. Just keep showing up. In the quiet hours after everyone had left, Diana sat in her apartment, flipping through the notebook hidden beneath her bed. She wrote a new line beneath the last entry. Empires are not only torn down by protest, sometimes they're reshaped by dance. She closed the book and smiled. This was just the beginning. Precise circles flowed across the floor as children danced. One with a prosthetic leg created a pattern of steps. Another spun with a joyous defiance of gravity. Richard Montgomery watched, his body tense and uncertain. It looks chaotic, he remarked, discomfort lining his voice. There is structure, Diana replied softly, her eyes following the children. It's just not the kind you recognize. She turned to Lucas, who watched the group with quiet wonder. Would you like to join in? Lucas nodded eagerly but hesitated, glancing up at his father. Go on, Richard said, forcing calm into his voice. I'm right here, as Diana gently led Lucas to the circle. Zoe approached Richard, holding out a chair. The first day is always the hardest, she said kindly. For the parents, not the kids. Richard gave a tight smile. This isn't therapy. I hired the best rehabilitation specialists for Lucas. And how has that been working out for him? Zoe asked gently, her tone soft but piercing. Before Richard could answer, the studio door opened. An older woman entered, regal, confident, leaning on an ornate cane. Her silver hair was braided with precision, her gaze sharp. Dr. Elaine Mercer, Zoe whispered, neuroscientist, specialized in brain plasticity, retired from Harvard. The woman greeted several children warmly before her eyes landed on Richard. Mr. Montgomery, she said with cool composure, you've rejected my research proposal 3 times in the last 2 years. Dr. Mercer, I didn't expect to see you here. I oversee this program, she explained. We're studying how non-directive movement can rewire the brain in children with motor challenges. Richard frowned. I thought this was a community dance class. Diana returned to his side, Lucas now experimenting with movement beside. Another child. Freedom Steps is a pilot rehabilitation program, she said. We integrate adaptive dance with cutting-edge neuroscience. It's based on movement autonomy. Then why are you working as a waitress? Richard challenged. Because we don't have funding, Diana replied calmly. Because people like you rejected us 3 times. Realization dawned on Richard. You were Dr. Mercer's assistant on those proposals. Co-author, Dr. Mercer corrected. Diana had to leave her graduate program to care for her sister, but her theoretical contributions are brilliant. You knew who I was at the restaurant, Richard said quietly. From the moment you walked in, Diana confirmed. And when Lucas got up to dance, I saw a moment. I followed it. Was that staged? That dance? No, she said, firmly. Lucas made the choice. I only supported it. Suddenly the door swung open again. A group of reporters entered, cameras and notepads in hand. Richard stiffened. "What is this?" he demanded. "Part 2 of the plan," Diana replied with a faint smile. Zoe held up her phone, displaying an article just published. "Revolutionary motor rehabilitation methodology shows promising results." "We published our first data today," Dr. Mercer said. "We invited the press to witness it." "You use my son for publicity?" Richard's voice turned icy. Diana stepped closer, calm but unwavering. "Come with me." She led him into a side room where photos of dozens of children adorned the walls, each with handwritten notes detailing their progress. On the last wall was a large, empty frame. "What's that?" "Our future," Diana said. "The rehabilitation center we could build, serving 500 children a year instead of 50 if we had the resources." Richard looked around, realization sinking deeper. "You orchestrated all of this," he said, almost in awe. "The dance, the meeting, bringing me here on press day." "I saw a window," Diana admitted, "and I took it. 4 months ago, when you cancelled our meeting without reading the proposal, I made a promise to myself I would find another way." Before Richard could respond, Zoe rushed into the room. "It's Lucas!" They hurried back into the studio. A hush had fallen. The music had stopped. Lucas stood in the center, surrounded by the other children. He had removed one of his braces and now balanced with a single support. "Lucas," Richard started forward, concern flooding him. "Wait," Diana whispered. "Just watch." Lucas stood still, focused, breathing deeply. Then, slowly, he took a step, small, shaky, but completely his own. The room held its breath, then erupted into cheers. Camera flashes lit the space. Children clapped, Zoe beamed. And Richard, usually composed, had tears in his eyes, glistening but unfallen. "That's why we created Freedom Steps," Diana said gently beside him. "It's not about perfect steps. It's about first steps. On their own." Richard looked at his son, not as a case, not as a problem, but as a person discovering his own strength. "This could have been done without manipulating me," he muttered. "It could have," Diana replied, "if you had answered our calls or read our proposal even once." Reporters started gathering around. One stepped forward, microphone raised. "Mr. Montgomery, can you comment on your presence here today? Is it true your foundation rejected this program 3 times? Richard looked at the cameras, at Diana, at Dr. Mercer. Then his gaze settled on Lucas, still practicing his step, unaware of the commotion around him. And then, to everyone's surprise, Richard smiled. "You know what's hardest for someone in my position," he said, addressing the reporter but speaking loudly for all to hear. "Admitting when we're wrong." A stunned silence followed. "The Montgomery Foundation," he continued, "is proud to announce full funding for Freedom Steps for the next 5 years. And we will build a permanent rehabilitation center based on the work of Dr. Mercer and Ms. Johnson." The room erupted. Flashes popped like fireworks. Children cheered again. Zoe clapped, her eyes misting. Dr. Mercer nodded in quiet pride. Diana blinked hard, emotions breaking through. Lucas looked up and saw his father smiling. A small smile returned to the boy's face. And in that moment, Richard saw more than progress. He saw freedom, purpose, hope. He had spent a lifetime building systems of control. But here, in this unexpected place, he had learned that not all strength comes from order. Some of it comes from letting go, letting a child dance, letting a moment unfold, and following, instead of leading. Zoe gasped in surprise. "On one condition," he said, eyes on Diana. "Ms. Johnson keeps full control, no corporate interference." 3 months later, bulldozers were clearing ground for the Freedom Steps Rehabilitation Center. It wasn't the flashiest Montgomery Foundation project, but it was the most meaningful, designed with input from the kids and their families. Diana oversaw construction regularly, never alone. Lucas came often, sometimes with other children. Surprisingly, so did Richard Montgomery. silently watching, sometimes scribbling notes. "I didn't expect you at board meetings," Diana said one afternoon. "I didn't expect to be studying neuroplasticity at 50, he replied, eyes tired but curious. In front of him, a science paper covered in post-it notes. Lucas asked to remove his second brace last week. "I know," Richard said. "He told me." His last therapist said it was impossible for 2 years, Diana smiled. "And you fired her," she added, "because you told me she was wrong." At the grand opening 6 months later, the hall buzzed with children in wheelchairs, braces and walkers, free, laughing. In the center, Lucas danced gently, now needing only a light brace. Confidence radiated from every step. Richard stood back. "He doesn't need you to hold him anymore," Diana said. "No," Richard replied, "but he still needs me around. That's the difference." A reporter asked, "Mr. Montgomery, how does it feel watching your son's journey?" "Proud," he said, "not of what he's overcome, but of what he's built for others." "And what's the biggest lesson?" Richard looked at Lucas, helping another child stand. "That leadership isn't about always being in front, it's about knowing when to follow." A year later, Freedom Steps expanded to 3 cities. Diana won a national award. Lucas became a youth ambassador, and Richard, he learned the hardest truth. Real power isn't in control, it's in letting go, because true revolutions, they begin with one brave step, and someone wise enough to follow. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, because sometimes the greatest change doesn't come from power or wealth, but from choosing to listen, to follow, and to believe in someone else's strength. Join us as we tell more stories that remind us. Real leadership begins with empathy.